What happens when a joke about trying other men stops being a joke the moment someone takes it seriously? How does a husband turn quiet heartbreak into lawful revenge? And why did I only realize what I'd lost when he calmly slid the wedding ring off my finger without a single word? My name is Sylvie Hartwell, and I used to think teasing meant honesty. I told myself that jokes were harmless, that laughter kept a marriage alive. I liked to say things people were too scared to admit. When my friends talked about being bored in long marriages, I'd smirk and say, maybe we should all get a free pass to try other men. It always got a laugh, and I loved how bold I sounded. Even Thomas used to smile at first, though it was never the kind of smile that reached his eyes. He was the serious one, measured, quiet, always the calmest man in the room. I used to mock him for it, saying he could turn a love song into a spreadsheet, but underneath that calm was something steady, something I didn't understand until it was gone. It started the night of our anniversary dinner. We went out with friends, and I'd already had 2 glasses of wine before he even sat down. Someone asked how marriage felt after 8 years, and I joked that maybe I should try other men just to make sure I picked right. The table laughed. Thomas didn't. I saw the look on his face, hurt mixed with patience, and I hated it. I laughed louder, said he knew I was kidding. Later that night, when Evan, a friend of a friend, leaned too close at the bar, I didn't move away. His hand brushed my arm, then lingered. I told myself it was harmless, just a moment, another joke that Thomas would roll his eyes at. Except he didn't roll his eyes. He saw everything. He didn't shout, didn't accuse. He waited until we got home, set his wedding ring on the kitchen table, and said quietly, "You've been proving your jokes for months." Then he walked out. I thought he'd cool off, like always. I told myself I hadn't really done anything wrong, that he was too sensitive, that he'd come back once he realized I was still the same woman he married. But that night, when the door closed behind him, something inside me knew the joke was finally over, and I was the only one still laughing. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. The night started like every other night. I thought I could get away with too much. We'd planned a small dinner for our 8th anniversary, something simple with 2 other couples we'd known for years. I wanted something bigger, music, cocktails, noise, but Thomas preferred quiet. He said anniversaries were about reflection, not spectacle. I rolled my eyes and told him I could reflect just fine with a drink in my hand. We went to a nice restaurant downtown, the kind with soft lighting and couples pretending to be happier than they were. I wore a red dress that I knew got attention. Thomas told me I looked beautiful when we left the house, but his tone was distant, almost formal. I told myself he was tired. He always seemed tired lately. At the restaurant, the conversation started harmless enough. Work stories, old memories, small jokes. But then someone asked, what kept a marriage exciting after so many years? Everyone laughed, waiting for someone to make a joke. I couldn't help myself. I said maybe the key was pretending to be single once in a while, just to see who still looked. The table laughed, loud and shocked, the way I wanted them to. Thomas didn't. He looked down at his drink. I nudged him under the table and said lightly, "Come on, I'm kidding." He said softly, "You always are." That annoyed me. I hated when he said things I couldn't argue with. So I pushed harder. I told another joke about how marriage was like renting the same movie every night. You start wondering what else is playing. Everyone laughed again, but this time the sound felt hollow. Thomas excused himself to the restroom. When he was gone, one of the wives leaned toward me and said, "You're brave for saying that stuff in front of him." I laughed and said, "It's just words. He knows me." But when he came back, his face was blank, not angry, just distant. That bothered me more than if he'd shouted. After dinner, we all decided to go for drinks at the bar next door. It was louder there, full of people who looked like they'd been trying to forget something all week. I ordered another cocktail, then another. I remember laughing too loud, moving too close to people. Thomas sat beside me for a while, sipping water, watching. Then Evan showed up. He was a friend of one of the guys at our table, tall, confident, the kind of man who thought charm was currency. He recognized me from some party years ago and started chatting. He asked how long I'd been married, and I said, long enough to joke about it. He laughed. He said I didn't seem like the married type. I told him maybe that was the problem. Thomas was right there. He heard everything. He didn't interrupt. He didn't even flinch. That made me reckless. I danced when someone pulled me toward the small dance floor. Evan joined. The music was loud and the lights low, and I felt a rush of attention I hadn't felt in a long time. He leaned close, said something I couldn't even hear, and his hand brushed my waist. I didn't move it away. I told myself it was nothing, just part of the game. Then his lips brushed my cheek, quick, light, meaningless. Except Thomas saw. I noticed him standing near the edge of the crowd, his face unreadable. He didn't come over, didn't say a word. He just turned and walked toward the door. I didn't chase him. I thought he'd wait in the car, that he'd be angry but calm down later. I stayed another half hour, pretending nothing was wrong. When I finally went outside, his car was gone. When I got home, the house was dark. His shoes were gone from the entryway. On the kitchen table, his wedding ring sat on top of a folded piece of paper. My stomach dropped. I unfolded it. It wasn't a letter. It was one line written in his neat handwriting. You've been proving your jokes for months. That's it. No explanation, no threats. Just that. I sat there for a long time, staring at the ring. I should have cried, but I didn't. Instead, I got angry. Angry that he made something small into something huge. Angry that he couldn't take a joke. Angry that he'd left instead of talking to me like an adult. When morning came, he still hadn't returned. His side of the bed was cold. I called him. No answer. I texted, "Can we talk?" No reply. I went through the motions that day, took Noah to school, checked my email, cleaned the kitchen. Every minute, I expected the door to open. It didn't. That evening, I called my mother. She answered with her usual half-laugh, half-sigh. "What did you do this time?" she said. I told her Thomas had walked out after a stupid misunderstanding. She asked what happened. I said he saw something at dinner, took it the wrong way. She said men always did. "He's dramatic," she said. "He'll come back once he realizes he's overreacted. Don't chase him. Let him sit in his guilt." I wanted to believe her. My mother had always been my mirror. Whatever I did, she'd find a way to make it sound clever, harmless. I told her it was just a kiss on the cheek, a stupid dare. She said, "Then stop feeling guilty. It's his pride, not your problem." That night, I opened a bottle of wine and scrolled through our old photos. We looked happy in most of them, but I started noticing how serious his face was beside my smile. How often I was the loud one, leaning in, performing for the camera. By the third glass, I convinced myself I wasn't wrong. I told myself he'd made me feel invisible for months, that I deserved to be seen. I even texted him again. "You can't walk out every time I make a joke." He didn't answer. The next morning, I found a letter in the mailbox with his handwriting on the envelope. My heart jumped, thinking he'd come to his senses. But inside was a plain document with an attached note from a law firm, notice of separation, pending financial and custody review. I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't a threat, it was real. I called him again, but the call went straight to voicemail. Then I called the number listed on the document. A woman answered politely, saying she represented Mr. Hartwell's preliminary filings. She said, "All communication will go through our office from now on." I hung up. My hands were shaking. I drove to my mother's house that afternoon, clutching the papers. She looked at them and scoffed. "He's bluffing," she said. "He's trying to scare you. He won't actually go through with it. But I saw doubt flicker in her eyes. I said, "He's serious, Mom. You should have seen the way he looked at me." She waved a hand. "He's a numbers man. Everything's about control. Let him have his little power trip." I stayed there that night. My mother poured wine and told me stories about her own marriage. How my father had once left for a week after a fight and still came back like nothing happened. "Men don't leave women like us," she said. "They just wait for us to apologize." Her confidence felt comforting then, like a blanket, but deep down, something in me didn't believe it. 2 days later, I went back to the house to grab a few things. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it, emptiness. He'd taken most of his clothes, his books, even the small framed photo from our wedding that used to sit on the shelf. Everything left behind looked carefully chosen. The furniture, the dishes, the life he didn't want anymore. There was another envelope on the counter. I didn't open it right away. I made coffee first, trying to act normal, but my hands were shaking. When I finally unfolded it, I saw pages of typed lists, joint accounts, property assets, visitation schedules for Noah. Every word was neat, logical, distant. At the bottom, there was one handwritten note. "You wanted attention. Now you have mine," in writing. I threw the papers across the counter. My coffee spilled over the floor, dark and bitter. That evening, I called him again, left a voicemail saying he was being cruel. I told him he was breaking up our family for no reason, that he was embarrassing me. I said we could fix this if he just talked to me. I almost believed it. A few hours later, I got a short text. "You proved your point. I'm finished talking." I remember staring at that message for what felt like hours. It wasn't even angry. It was final. I called my mother again. She told me to stop giving him power. "Post something online," she said. "Show people you're fine. Show him you don't care." So I did. I posted a photo of me and Noah at the park smiling. I captioned it, "Some things are worth fighting for." The comments came quickly, friends saying I looked strong, that I'd get through it. A few asked where Thomas was. I ignored them. That night, I got a new message from an unknown number. It had no text, just a link. I clicked it before thinking. It opened to a short video clip, me and Evan at the restaurant bar. I was laughing, his hand on my waist. Thomas was visible in the background, watching. The clip ended right as he turned to leave. My stomach dropped. My hands went cold. The next message came seconds later. Now I don't have to explain. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I called my mother in tears, told her someone had sent the video. She said it had to be a trick, that no one would care about a moment like that. But I cared, because I realized then that Thomas wasn't acting from anger. He was building a case. He wasn't going to scream or argue. He was going to erase me, slowly, legally, and with proof. The next morning, my mother came over, trying to sound calm. She said, "You can still fix this. Just talk to him." But I knew the man I'd married, the one who thought before speaking, who planned before reacting. Once he'd made a decision, nothing could move him. I didn't tell her that what scared me most wasn't that he might leave for good. It was that he already had, long before that night at the bar. For years, I'd mistaken his patience for weakness. I'd mocked his quiet nature, thinking my noise kept things alive. Now, his silence felt like a weapon. And the worst part? He didn't have to lift a finger. He just had to stop catching me when I fell. I spent the next few days pretending the world hadn't started collapsing. I told people Thomas was staying with a friend and that we were working things out. Every lie rolled off my tongue smoother than the last. It almost felt natural. I had always been good at controlling the story, making myself the misunderstood one, the playful one, never the cruel one. My friends bought it at first. They said Thomas was uptight, that he didn't know how lucky he was. Even my mother repeated that line so often, it started to sound like truth. "You're the fun one," she said. "Men don't leave fun women for long." But something had changed. The quiet between my lies was starting to sound like an echo. Every time I opened my phone, I half expected another message from him, another piece of proof I couldn't talk my way out of. By Friday, my mother convinced me to host a small family dinner at her place. Just to remind everyone you're fine. I didn't want to, but I went along. I told myself that if Thomas heard about it, he might remember the life we had before that stupid night. The evening started normal enough. My sister came with her husband. My mother fluttered around the kitchen, full of advice no one wanted. Everyone smiled too much, spoke too gently, like I was a patient recovering from something shameful. Halfway through dinner, my mother's phone buzzed. She frowned, squinting at the screen. Then she turned it toward me. A message from Thomas's sister, one I hadn't spoken to in weeks. Attached was a short video, the same one. Me at the bar, laughing, Evan's hand around my waist. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The sound of forks scraping plates filled the silence. My sister cleared her throat and said, "Maybe you should just admit it happened." I said, "Admit what? That I laughed at a joke?" She looked at me with pity that made my stomach turn. "It wasn't just laughing, Sylvie." My mother immediately jumped in. "Oh, please, he's blowing it out of proportion. Men do worse every day and still get forgiven." My father, who'd been quiet all night, said softly, "It's not about men, Diana. It's about respect." The room went still. My mother glared at him. "You're taking his side?" "I'm saying," he replied, "that walking out doesn't happen in a vacuum." I pushed my chair back so hard it scraped the floor. "You all think you know what happened," I said, "but none of you were there." My mother followed me into the kitchen, whispering urgently, "You can't let them see you upset. He's turning everyone against you. That's his strategy." I wanted to believe that, but deep down, I knew she was wrong. Thomas didn't need to turn anyone. The truth was doing that on its own. When I got home later that night, another email was waiting. The subject line read, "Evidence verification completed." My stomach twisted as I opened it. Attached were legal forms, copies of timestamps, the bar's security camera release authorization, with Thomas's name listed as the client. He'd made it official. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. He wasn't just collecting proof. He was documenting my downfall. Calmly, cleanly, without a single wasted word. I called him again, one last time, and this time he picked up. His voice was even, polite, like we were strangers. I said, "You're destroying me." He said, "You did that yourself." I whispered, "It was one night." He paused, then said, "No, it was every night you thought I was too boring to love." Then the line went dead. I didn't cry. Not then. I sat in the dark kitchen until morning, staring at his empty chair at the table. It was the quietest night of my life. A few days later, I went to his office. I told myself it was to fix things, to reason with him, but really, I just wanted to be seen again. The receptionist looked startled when I walked in. She asked if I had an appointment. I said, "Tell him his wife is here." When he came out, he didn't even look surprised. He motioned for me to follow him into a small conference room. The blinds were half drawn, the light sharp and cold. I started talking fast before he could. "This is ridiculous, Thomas. Lawyers. Evidence. Do you really want our son to grow up watching us hate each other?" He didn't sit. He just stood there, calm as always. "Our son deserves parents who don't turn everything into a performance." I crossed my arms. "You think you're perfect? You think freezing accounts and sending videos makes you better than me?" He said, "No, it just makes me prepared." I laughed bitterly. "You're doing this because I embarrassed you." He shook his head. "I'm doing this because you turned our life into a joke I never laughed at." I tried to reach him, tried to sound softer. "Thomas, I didn't mean it. I was drunk. He interrupted quietly. "You were yourself." Those words hit like a slap. I said, "You can't just erase me. I'm still your wife." He looked at me then, really looked, and said, "Not anymore." Then he handed me a folder from his desk. My name was printed neatly on the front. Petition for divorce. Filed. Inside were pages of neatly typed information, joint assets, visitation schedules, a proposal for shared custody. At the bottom was his signature. I flipped through them with shaking hands. "You've been planning this," I said. He nodded. "Since the night I realized your jokes were confessions." He opened the door for me, polite as always, and said, "My lawyer will contact you next week." I wanted to scream, to throw the folder, to demand that he shout at me so I could hate him. But he didn't. He just closed the door gently when I left. That night, my mother came over again. I showed her the papers, hoping for comfort, maybe even outrage. Instead, she frowned and said, "You can't let him win. You have to show him you're not scared." "Win?" I said. "This isn't a game." She put a hand on my shoulder. "Everything's a game, Sylvie. You just forgot how to play." I turned away. I didn't want her advice anymore. She still thought this was about pride. She didn't understand that I wasn't fighting to win. I was just trying to survive what I'd done. A week later, I got the official notice for mediation. The date was set. The terms were outlined. It felt unreal, like something happening to someone else. I told myself I'd go there and fix everything, that once he saw me face to face again, he'd remember we were a family. The day of the meeting, I wore a dark blue dress, the same one I'd worn to his promotion dinner years ago. Back then, he'd said I looked like home. I tried to hold on to that memory, like it could save me. The mediation office was clean, bright, too cold. Thomas was already there when I walked in, sitting beside his lawyer. He looked up briefly, nodded once, then went back to organizing his documents. I sat down across from him, my heart racing. The mediator began with polite words about fairness and cooperation. Thomas's lawyer opened a folder and began listing assets, accounts, agreements. Every word felt sharp and final. When it was my turn to speak, I said, "This isn't what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be fixing this." The mediator smiled thinly. "Mrs. Hartwell, the purpose today is to discuss settlement, not reconciliation." Thomas didn't react. He just adjusted his tie and waited. I turned to him. "You don't have to do this. You can still stop it." He said calmly, "You already stopped it. I'm just finishing it." I felt the heat rise in my face. "So that's it? After everything?" He met my eyes. "Everything is why." Then his lawyer slid a new document across the table. Custody arrangements, visitation limits. Attached was a short note from a child psychologist recommending primary stability under Thomas's care due to the mother's pattern of impulsivity. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "You had me evaluated," I whispered. He said, "No, I just let the facts speak." My mother, who'd insisted on coming, slammed her hand on the table. "This is ridiculous. You're humiliating her." Thomas finally looked at her, his voice steady. "No, Mrs. Lowe, I'm protecting my son." The room went silent. The mediator cleared her throat and suggested a recess. Thomas stood, gathered his papers neatly, and said he was done for the day. I called after him as he walked out, but he didn't turn back. I sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the empty chair across from me. My mother muttered something about men being heartless, but I barely heard her. All I could think about was the quiet way he'd said, "I'm protecting my son." It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was conviction. When I finally drove home, the sky was grey, heavy with rain. The house looked smaller somehow, like it was shrinking without him. I went inside, dropped my bag on the floor, and sat at the kitchen table where his ring had once been. The surface still had a faint mark where it used to sit. I wanted to call him, to beg, to scream, but I didn't. I knew it wouldn't matter. Later that night, I walked into the bedroom. The closet was half empty. I reached for one of his old shirts hanging there, pressed it to my face and breathed in the faint scent of detergent and paper, the smell of someone who'd always been patient enough to clean up after me. I stood there for a long time, the house completely silent. For once, there was no laughter, no noise, no defense, just the echo of my own voice from that night, saying I could try other men. The words sounded poisonous now. When I finally lay down, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him sliding the ring off his finger, setting it on the table like it was evidence. And maybe it was. Evidence that I'd mistaken being loved for being tolerated. Evidence that even the quietest people eventually decide to stop catching you when you fall. I had spent years laughing at seriousness, mocking restraint, calling his patience weakness. Now, the silence he left behind was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. The mediation ended, but the silence between us didn't. Everything after that day felt like paperwork and echoes. I'd wake up, feed Noah, go through emails, and every once in a while, I'd see something. His handwriting on an old receipt, his sweater still hanging in the hallway, and it would knock the air out of me. My mother kept saying we could still fix things. She'd come over with advice I didn't ask for, repeating the same words like spells. He's not serious. He's just proving a point. But each time she said it, I believed her less. Thomas wasn't proving anything. He was closing doors one by one and making sure they stayed shut. The official court date arrived faster than I thought it would. My lawyer told me not to expect much to change. Thomas's filings were clean, well-documented, unemotional. It sounded like a compliment, but to me, it felt like a verdict. The morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. My reflection looked older somehow. I thought about how I'd joked once that Thomas made me feel like a widow in advance. Always calm, always distant, as if already preparing for life without me. Now I realized he'd just been enduring me, waiting for the moment he wouldn't have to anymore. When I arrived at the courthouse, he was there already, standing by the doors with his lawyer. He looked the same as always, neat, quiet, put together. No anger, no bitterness, just control. I wanted to scream at him for it, to see some trace of emotion, but there was nothing. Inside, the judge spoke softly, reading through the documents. Every word felt like it came from underwater. Legal language, property division, custody terms. Each phrase was another brick sealing a wall I'd built myself. When the judge asked if either party wished to add anything, I looked at Thomas, waiting for him to speak. He didn't. He just nodded once. I stood up, hands trembling, and said, "I didn't cheat." The judge looked up briefly. "Mrs. Hartwell, this isn't a criminal trial. We're here to finalize—" I interrupted. "It was a joke. I made a mistake, but it wasn't betrayal." Thomas's lawyer looked uncomfortable, but Thomas didn't move. He didn't roll his eyes or sigh. He just watched me, the same way he had that night at the bar. Silent, I sank back into my chair. The judge continued reading. When the final papers were signed, the sound of the stamp hitting the page was louder than anything else in the room. Thomas gathered his documents, shook the lawyer's hand, and left without looking back. I followed him into the hallway. "Thomas, wait." He stopped but didn't turn around. "Can we talk?" I said quietly. "Just 5 minutes." He turned then, his expression unreadable. "We've been talking for years. You just called it teasing." I swallowed hard. "You can't just erase me." He stepped closer, his voice even. "You erased yourself. I just kept the records." I wanted to say something, anything, but nothing came out. He gave a small nod, almost polite, and walked away. I stood there long after he disappeared down the corridor. People passed by, some glancing at me, most not. I realized then that to everyone else, I was just another woman who'd lost something she thought she'd never have to earn. When I finally went home, the house felt wrong, not just empty, hollow. I could hear my own footsteps on the floorboards. I sat at the kitchen table, the same place where his ring had once been, and just stared at the surface until the sun went down. Later that evening, there was a soft knock on the door. I almost didn't answer, but when I did, It was his mother, Elaine. She looked tired but not unkind. "I just came for Noah's things," she said. I nodded and let her in. She moved quietly through the house, packing a few clothes, a stuffed animal, a book. When she finished, she turned to me and said, "You know, I don't hate you." I looked up. "Then why do you sound like you do?" She smiled faintly. "Because I've seen this before. People who mistake being admired for being loved. It ends the same way every time. Loneliness." I tried to laugh, but it came out shaky. "You think he's innocent?" She shook her head. "No one is, but he's consistent. You never were." She left soon after, and I stood at the door until her car lights faded. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked around the house, touching things that used to mean something. The couch where we'd sat on lazy Sundays, the chair where he'd read bedtime stories to Noah, the framed photo from our wedding. I turned it face down. The next morning, an envelope was waiting on the porch. No stamp, just my name written in his careful handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Final notice, custody and property settlement completed. Beneath it, a smaller note in his writing. "You always wanted to test limits." This was the last one. I read it twice before folding it back into the envelope. I didn't cry. I was past tears. A few hours later, my mother called. She sounded nervous for once. "Your father saw Thomas at the courthouse," she said. "He mentioned you might have to move. Is that true?" I told her yes. The house was part of the settlement. She sighed. "Well, maybe it's for the best. Fresh start." I almost laughed. A fresh start, as if I hadn't burned the ground I'd have to walk on. When I hung up, I went to the living room and opened the windows. The air outside was warm, almost kind. I closed my eyes and listened to the distant sound of traffic, the hum of a world that hadn't stopped just because mine had. By evening, I packed a small box of things I couldn't leave behind. Noah's drawings, a few photos, one of Thomas's old notebooks. At the bottom of the drawer, I found the wedding ring he'd left months ago. I hadn't touched it since. I turned it over in my hand, watching how the light hit it. For the first time, I noticed how scratched it was. He'd worn it through everything. Work, chores, the quiet years where I thought he'd stopped caring. Every mark was a moment I hadn't paid attention to. I set it back down on the table, exactly where he'd left it the night he walked out. The surface was bare now except for that ring and one final envelope I hadn't noticed before. It had been slipped under the door while I was upstairs. Inside was a single printed photograph, me at the bar with Evan, the same one he'd used in the filings, but this time someone had written across the bottom in neat black ink, "You said marriage was a game. Consider this the scorecard." I sat there for a long time, staring at that line, until the words lost their shape. Outside, the sky was beginning to turn orange. The house smelled faintly of dust and leftover perfume. I realized I hadn't cooked in weeks. I hadn't done much of anything but replay, that night over and over. The laughter, the look on his face, the silence that followed. My mother called again around 9, asking if I was okay. I said I was fine, that I just needed rest. She started to say something else, but I hung up before she could finish. After that, I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table again. The ring and the photo were still there. I placed the ring beside the picture, the two symbols of everything I'd lost, what I'd mocked and what I'd proven. The next morning, I woke early, the house filled with pale light. I looked around at the quiet rooms, the empty walls, and felt something settle inside me. Not peace exactly, but understanding. He hadn't taken revenge. He'd taken back dignity. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't break things. He just gathered proof, stayed calm, and let the truth do the talking. That's the part I hadn't understood before. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's judgment that doesn't need words. When Noah came home that afternoon, he asked why the house looked different. I told him we were moving soon. He nodded like he understood more than I wanted him to. He looked up at me and said, "Daddy said you both love me, just not together anymore." I froze. I didn't know what to say, so I just hugged him, hard, hoping he couldn't feel the guilt under my skin. That night, after he went to bed, I stood by the window again. The street was quiet, the kind of stillness that used to make me restless. Now it felt like a sentence being served. I thought about all the times I'd laughed at his calmness, called him predictable, said I needed more excitement. I'd found it, and lost everything stable in return. On the kitchen table, the ring still glinted faintly in the dim light. I reached out, picked it up one last time and whispered, "You can have it back." Then I set it down gently beside the photograph, turned off the lights, and walked upstairs. In the morning, I'd pack the rest of our things, sign whatever final papers came next, and start over somewhere smaller, quieter, somewhere without echoes. But before I went to sleep, I looked around the room one last time, whispering to no one, "You were right, Thomas. I turned love into a joke." And just like that, I finally stopped laughing. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.